Astro Command is a new real-time strategy game made by Armchair Historian, who, if you're not familiar, is probably one of the biggest history channels on YouTube. This game takes place during the 7 Years' War, which, from my perspective, often feels overlooked, but maybe that's just because I'm an American. In school, we're often only taught about the North American conflicts, and we call it the French and Indian War. We're basically exclusively taught that the conflict was the reason that England was in so much debt, and that's why they raised taxes, and then of course that's also where George Washington, the GOAT, first encountered combat. But obviously there's a lot more to it. I imagine if you go to school, or if you're from Europe, you probably learned a bit more about it. But I will give a bit of an intro and a bit of a brief overview of it. The conflict in Europe was chiefly over Austria attempting to reclaim Silesia from Prussia, and then multiple other conflicts around the world sort of coincided with the European War going on. So while war was raging in Central Europe, England was also fighting France and Spain in North America. They were also fighting in the Philippines against Spain, and the French and English also fought in India. It affected almost every single continent and is often thought of as a proto-World War I, since almost every corner of the earth was involved. The conflict ended with Prussia keeping Silesia, showing the world that Prussia was now a world power and was able to stand on its own. Well, not exactly, but it was able to fight off multiple global powers. England conquered much of North America east of the Mississippi. They also cemented dominance over India, and they took Florida from Spain. Russia was also involved, as they were very fearful of Prussia's growing influence and power over Central and Eastern Europe. But weirdly enough, they pieced out of the war because Empress Elizabeth of the Russian Empire died, and then Peter III succeeded her. And he was just a big fan of Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, so he just sort of made peace. Which is very weird. Like, I just can't imagine that happening today. Like, if Putin died and then a successor just made peace with Ukraine because he was a big Zelensky fan, like he just loved his comedy. I know it's not exactly apples to apples, but it's just very strange. Now, that's a very sort of basic overview of what is a very interesting conflict, and you can of course watch Armchair Historian's new video on it to get a better understanding, or one of the other myriad of other videos on YouTube about it, or of course you could also read books, but you know, blah, am I right? But let's actually start talking about the game. So Master of Command takes all that global chaos from the 7 Years' War and boils it down into a pretty tight real-time strategy experience. It also has some light roguelite elements. In this game, it's all about the battles. There is no base building or anything of that nature. It's sort of a cross between like Total War and Battle Brothers, which you might not quite understand the Battle Brothers thing, but seriously, compare the two games, especially the art styles, they're pretty similar. Now that might sound a bit weird or confusing, but let's just start with you opening the game. So first off, there is a new campaign mode and then the Rise of Frederick mode. The Rise of Frederick mode is just a bit like a tutorial. You're only going to be playing battles, not really interacting with the other elements of the game. They're pretty fun, that gets you straight to the action. Or you can get into the meat of the game, which is a new campaign. So after picking that button, you'll then get to pick what nation to play as. The options are all the big players we talked about: France, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and England. After picking a nation and starting army, which at the start when you first start playing, you'll only have one army to choose from for each of the option, but playing unlocks more and more, and then you'll be told to pick a mission, and that decides what objectives you're going to have. After that, you'll be dropped into your army view, and you'll finally get to see your units and officers, as well as the items on the right of the screen that you can equip your men with. This is where the more roguelite aspects come out, where you can equip and specialize your men. You can give them new weapons, deployable covers, tools to get more cover, new boots. There's dozens and dozens of items that are all at least semi-useful, or of course you can sell the excess goods to get some money. Speaking of money, let's talk about the resources that you're going to have to keep your eye on while you play. So there is gold, which you use to purchase new units, buy goods, and other regiment augmenters. Next is supplies, which you can use money to buy. This sort of represents the food and other general miscellaneous supplies that your army needs to keep running. Once you run out of food, you start to suffer attrition, you lose manpower. Speaking of which, the next resource that you have to keep an eye on is manpower. You use this to replenish losses after battle, and then there's ammo, which you can use to either train your troops or replenish units' ammo supply after a battle. Each of these resources are of paramount importance to your army, especially as you move around the map. which, as you might be seeing from the gameplay that I'm currently have on, when you're not fighting, you are moving around the map, going to different interactive things, like maybe you're going to be sieging down a fort, which will give you new doctrines to unlock, which gives you new modifiers for your troop. Maybe you're stopping at a town and buying goods. Maybe you're stopping at slums. There's a lot of interactive things to do around the map when you're not just fighting. These resources that I just mentioned are very important because things like running out of food can absolutely kill your game, as your army will quickly grind to a halt and starve to death and have soldiers desert or just die. And of course, not having enough manpower can allow you to be easily picked off after a battle where you can't replenish your losses. And same with the ammo. Each resource really feels more important the more you play, because the game has a 3-act structure every single time you start a campaign. It sort of starts off rather easy, and with resources being cheap to buy and easy to get, since you can get easy resources by raiding towns, but each act gets progressively harder and harder. In Act 3, every single town starts raided, which causes prices to be higher, and that makes resources scarcer. It doesn't allow you to get easy stuff by raiding, and the armies get harder and harder. Another interesting management aspect of the game is upgrading troops. When you recruit troops, there are a certain tier of troops. So maybe you start as England and you start off with some redcoat recruits. You can then, once you get enough XP by using them getting kills, or maybe you're training them by using ammunition, you can then upgrade them to the next tier and you get to decide. So maybe you turn them into redcoats, or maybe you turn them into grenadiers. There are over 150 units to choose from and recruit. There's lots of different types. There's heavy cavalry, light cavalry, dragoons, line infantry, grenadiers, snipers. There's tons and tons of units, and they all feel useful and like they actually play a role. Since we're talking about units, let's actually talk about how the battles work. It plays a lot like Total War or Ultimate General Civil War. You'll have a deploy stage at the start where you'll set up your troops, and then once you press start, it's time to go. You can click and drag over troops, you can move them any way you want. Flanking is very important, and so is morale. Unlike other war games where it's all about killing as many enemies as possible, in this game, much like actual, more musket warfare, it was about shattering the enemy's morale. Who cares about how many of them you kill, as long as they're running away and retreating? You should have the same motives as generals back then did. You want them to retreat. It doesn't matter about how many of them you kill. Firing off a volley, then charging in with heavy infantry can rout lines of men, or using cavalry to attack from behind or the side can turn the tide of battle, and you can use cavalry like a tidal wave and roll over the whole line of enemy units as you attack from the flank. There's also units like dragoons, who are mounted light infantry essentially, and use them to harass enemy troops from behind. And of course, artillery plays a large part. Cannons can cause massive damage and massive moral damage, and you can use real-world tactics like a grand battery system, which Napoleon was famous for, where you have all your artillery focus on one side of the line, using that to cripple and rout them before they reach your line, or you can spread out your artillery and ensure even fire across the whole map. Another cool thing about the game is that you can decide if your troops use volley fire or individual fire, which, if you're unfamiliar, the real-world firing techniques / orders that officers would give, there was volley fire, which is devastating to morale, and it's probably what you're thinking of when you imagine 18th century warfare. You know, if you ever seen the movie The Patriot, you know, where they line up and just shoot at each other, that's what a volley is. It's all about inflicting massive, like, morale damage. You want to rattle them, and of course that's also a great way to actually get kills, because these guns are notoriously not very accurate, so by massing fire, you get more kills, and it also shocks them pretty bad. Or you can switch over to individual fire, which does allow you to reload quicker and get off more shots, but it's not as devastating because the morale is not affected as much, and you don't get to kill as many of them at a time. I also really want to mention just how this game does a good job of showing how each different type of unit and armies back then had different and useful roles. I feel like games like Total War sort of always struggled with that. Like in Total War Empire, you could just have cannons and line infantry. That would solve almost everything. That's about all you needed in your army, and then a little bit of cavalry to rout them after. In Master of Command, you're going to have a pretty tough time if you only plan on using artillery and regular light infantry. You're going to need cavalry to flank behind or counter their cavalry. You're going to need light infantry like snipers to pick them across the map and sort of wear them down before they get to your main line. I think this game does a great job of actually having you utilize every single aspect of your arsenal instead of just relying on some tried and true tested method like you can in other games. I feel like the AI is pretty decent. I feel like they flanked me a couple times. I feel like they're pretty good at capitalizing on my mistakes or when I'm overextended. I saw other people mention that they think the AI is a bit stupid. I wasn't feeling that. I was playing on regular difficulty where there's no negative or positive modifiers at all. But, you guys are looking at my gameplay. Am I just bad? Because I feel like the AI gives a pretty appropriate challenge, especially after you leave Act 1. I feel like it's a pretty tough challenge, especially as their armies get bigger and bigger. Another thing I love about the game is the graphics and feel of the game. Now, I know the graphics don't look ultra realistic, but I love seeing the volley fire of troops or seeing the individual fire. I love how you can actually scroll in and see them shooting that way. I love hearing the musket fire and seeing the smoke come off in front of them. I like how you can scroll in on the cannons and you can hear them fire and your screen shakes. I feel like the game just has great presentation. And then you can also customize each of your units' uniforms and flags that they wear into battle, and it actually reflects when you're playing the game. You can also rename your officers, and then each of your officers also has different traits that they can have, and they get XP the same way as your regular units do. So you can sort of customize each individual, I guess you would call it a brigade, the way you want, because this game is all about specialization. Now, this game does have a few issues. I feel like they do have a somewhat lack of maps. I've played for around 30 hours, so maybe if you don't play as much as I have, you won't notice it, but you do get repeat maps a lot, and the maps are just random. It's not affected at all by where you're actually battling on the overworld map. It'll just generate you a map from one of the pre-selected ones that they have. It's not at all based on where you're at. So I feel like that's a bit of an issue, but again, if you're not going to play that much, you probably won't feel that. I also think the game is a bit pricey. I think $30 is sort of a lot for the content in the game. I think maybe a more $20 or $25 price point would be a bit more fair. But again, if this is your type of game like it is mine, I think $30 is fine. But I do think some people might wait for it to go on sale. I also think the terrain modifiers in game are a bit lacking. I think your troops should get more benefits for being on hills or shooting at troops crossing rivers. I just feel like that played a big part in warfare back then and even now. Across any era in time, terrain was a huge modifier. And in this game, you really just don't feel that as much. But that's really most of my issues with the game, and you can notice I really don't have that much to complain about. I think this game is really great. I think some of my issues with the game are a bit more nitpicky, and I think a lot of them will be solved as they continue to update and add more content. And I think it's just a lot of fun and covers a relatively overlooked war. And again, that's just from my perspective, I'm not sure what you guys are taught in Europe. I do know I have a pretty sizable non-American audience. So please do tell me, is this a big deal in your country? Because in America, it's not at all. I think most Americans would probably be 7 years war. What is that? But I'm really glad that they decided to tackle a game about it, and I think this game is beyond fun and beyond replayable. You can try with different army combinations, different troops that you have. There's a lot of replayability, and even when you lose, you can just start a new game and try again. But that's really all I have. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, please like and subscribe. And then sorry if I'm not my usual upbeat self. I just got I got killed today at work. I got bitched at so much. But, that's how it goes sometimes. But please remember that Jesus loves you.